So can you see that? Because I'm going to be putting pictures up there. Jeff, I have my own stopwatch here, but keep me on time. And I'm going to be talking fairly quickly because I'm going to be talking about 50 years. So I'm going to get going. Basically, we're talking about obstacles on the road to opportunity in our communities. I'm going to give you some history and context. We'll talk about policies and their impacts. We'll share some ideas about what work in removing obstacles to opportunity. And then we'll talk a little bit about some emerging roadblocks and new challenges. So what do we mean when we're talking about a promise of opportunity? Well, you know what? I think we all know what we mean. It was written on the mission statement out there when you first came in. It's that every child, regardless of race, ethnicity, zip code, gender, has access to the best possible life, their best, brightest future, great schools, safe communities, affordable housing, a good paying job. That's how we create our best Commonwealth. So I'm just going to start with a picture. We're going to start with what's called the post-World War II boom. I'm going to be drawing you a picture. This picture is in the form of a graph. And on the bottom you see dates, 1948 to 1973. Going up is growth. So if something has grown by 100%, it means it's doubled. And Professor Watson is familiar with this. This is productivity. Productivity is technically, it's net productivity, output per worker hour, but let's basically say this is a picture of the growth of the economy during the post-World War II period. What do you see? It's growing, right? It's about doubling in size. Here's another line. This is compensation. It's wages and benefits for non-supervisory workers, but basically this is what goes into people's pockets, okay? Productivity is growing, the economy is growing, and wages growing right along with it. So these lines are very tightly aligned. I think that's what's so interesting about this post-World War II period. So this is a picture of post-World War II America. I'm going to show you another set of slides. This is, if you lined everybody up this is the US, you lined everybody up by their household income and you broke them into groups. This is what was happening during this period with folks whose incomes were at the lowest level, at the bottom. Their incomes were growing at about this same rate. There are wiggles up and down, but their incomes were growing. Incomes in the middle, growing at the same rate. Incomes for those at the top, also growing at about the same rate. I think what's very interesting about this picture of post-World War II America is that the economy's growing, everybody's income is growing about the same way. I'm going to show you another picture of post-World War II America, and it's this. This is an ad from the Ford Motor Company, 1950, and what it says is, now thousands own 2 fine cars. And what I love about this is because this, to me, is a picture of this idea of a growing standard of living. The idea is people used to maybe be able to have 1 car, now they have 2. Now they can afford 2. So that's another picture of the post-World War II economic boom. So there's a promise of prosperity for anyone with access, with anyone with a good job, but there were barriers that kept prosperity from some. Okay, there were policies that kept this opportunity from some communities. This is a picture of Boston. This is a picture of Albany. This is a picture of Chicopee, and what these are is this a little earlier, the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, early 40s, federal organization. This is a federal organization sent bankers and mortgage brokers out into their communities and said, describe your community, describe these communities for me, and let's draw maps. And they color-coded the maps. There were blue communities that were really good, and green ones, yellow ones that were kind of risky. And then there were communities that were colored red. They were outlined in red. That's where you might have heard the term redlining. That's where that comes from. This is a federal organization that sort of set this up. And what the Homeowners Loan Corporation had these folks do is write reports describing these communities that had been color-coded Here's an excerpt from one of these reports, and very explicitly, communities that were outlined in red, where the banks were instructed, don't sell mortgages in these communities. These are hazardous communities for doing business loans. In other words, we are saying to you, we want to limit opportunity for folks in these communities. It was very explicitly communities that had poor people living in them, immigrants, people of color, very, very explicitly. So my point being, these were decisions made by policymakers and regulators at that time that affected access to opportunity in those communities. I don't have time to go into this. This is a great book if you're interested in this issue, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, that lists some of the other kinds of policies. I want to be very clear. Policies matter. These were policies that affected access to opportunities in some communities. So this is post-World War II America. We have a booming economy, wage growth for some, and barriers to opportunity for some as well. So these two things are happening simultaneously. So that leads us into the 50s. We have the Civil Rights Movement. And then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And in his State of the Union address, he says he wants to declare a war on poverty. And what are the weapons he's going to use in this war? The weapons are better schools, health care, safe and affordable homes, training, jobs. These are the weapons in the declared war on poverty. These are, I'm not going to read this list. It's a long and overwhelmingly impressive list of legislation that was passed during this period. But if you scan down this, you can see that this was an attempt to use policy levers to address the barriers that had been erected or barriers that had been allowed to remain that limited access to opportunity in rural communities. There are particular concerns about rural poverty. You know, you live in a rural area out here, and in the cities as well. I'm just going to highlight in 1964 the Economic Opportunity Act. And on signing the act, the president said, "Today, for the first time in all the history of the human race, a great nation is able to make and is willing to make a commitment to eradicate poverty among its people." And how did they do that? One of the ways you know very well. This is the network of the community action agencies that was created with the signing of the Economic Opportunity Act in the 60s. So there you are out in the corner. This is part of what this war on poverty was all about. So did it work? Okay, well, let's take a look. We have data from the US Census, United States and Massachusetts. This is sort of poverty rates during this period, 1960 poverty rates, 1970. You can see poverty cutting about a third, okay? Looks like this is kind of good. Maybe this war on poverty is really working. So I'm going to give you some more data. This now is child poverty, and I will tell you we didn't even measure child poverty before the war on poverty, so we don't have Massachusetts numbers for that. But what you can see is, okay, poverty drops, but then what do you notice? It's kind of stuck, right? It's not continuing to drop. So what's going on? Is it that did this war on poverty not really work? What's happening? Well, what's particularly interesting is that the Census Bureau a couple of years ago developed an alternative way of looking at poverty, different from the official poverty measure. It's called the supplemental poverty measure. And the way that that alternative measure is created is it actually allows you to identify the impact of safety net programs on poverty. You can actually measure it now. And what this shows you, these are Massachusetts numbers that SNAP or food stamps, housing assistance, and the other safety net programs, in fact, in Massachusetts, have cut poverty in half, okay? 920,000 people kept out of poverty thanks to these programs. Think about George Bailey. If he hadn't lived, 920,000 people more in Massachusetts would be in poverty were it not for these programs. And the numbers, these are the numbers for kids in Massachusetts. 200,000 kids in Massachusetts kept out of poverty, thanks to the work you all do in your communities. So we know, okay, we know that the safety net programs are not the issue. So what's going on? Let's look a little more at policy. So we've seen these lines before, productivity, compensation. Now we're going to look at these numbers going into today, okay? Here's the economy. Fine, it's continuing to grow, right? Let's look at what's happened to compensation. So during this same period, the economy is growing, but compensation, what's going into workers' pockets, has flattened. And we can see this in income. This is incomes at the 20th percent. This is just from 1980 to the present. Incomes, this is Massachusetts numbers. Incomes at the bottom, incomes at the middle are flat. But wait a minute. This doesn't make sense because we see the economy is growing. Where is the economic benefit of all of that productivity going? It's not going into the pockets of people at the bottom or in the middle. Well, this is what's happened to incomes at the top 1%. And what we see is that there were policies in that we're at that break in the sort of period of the 70s. There were policies. The federal government allowed the minimum wage, the value of the minimum wage, to falter. There were protections for unions and unionized workers were diminished. There were macroeconomic policies that emphasized emphasized inflation rather than employment. There were various policy decisions made in that period. And this is the impact of those policies. So let's just look at it very quickly. This is the new Massachusetts minimum wage, just as of January 1st, $12 full-time work at the Mass minimum wage. These are the official poverty levels. Point is, full-time work, people are working. Even you can be working full-time, working really hard, and still be poor. Okay? And the point, you don't have to look at all these numbers. Just look at that 61%. That I want to make the connection between low-wage work and poverty. I think most of you who work in the community know that most people who are poor are working. They're just not earning enough.
Are these slides available?
Yes, I believe they will be.
And we also have full reports, copies of full reports downstairs. And if you need one, just contact me and I'll get you one.
So many of these, some of these slides are actually updated, more recent numbers than the one that's in the published report, because I wrote that back in May, and the Census Bureau keeps updating their numbers. But the story is all there and in that report. So this is low wage growth and other policies, barriers to opportunity have created variations, disparities in income across the state. We talked about when people don't have access to opportunity in their communities, they don't have access to good jobs. And I want to show you this map, just so you can see. We said that the median state income, families with kids, is about $96,000. But in our communities up here, you can see it's about half that. So there's enormous disparities across the Commonwealth as well. And so it's really important when you look at statewide numbers, I think, to just always dig a little deeper. By the way, these data are on the Kids Count Data Center. You can get all of these numbers in the map as well. There's also wide disparities in wealth. A study from the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston a couple of years ago. Where do most people get their wealth? From their house. And if your family has been denied access to a mortgage, it's harder for you to have access to a house. And people, wealth gets transferred from generation to generation. So there are generational impacts of barriers to opportunity. So I think the disparities in wealth, about $250,000 for a white household, $8 for a black household, are really significant. And disparities in income, disparities in wealth lead to poverty. And for all kids in Massachusetts, it's about 14%, but you can see for Latinx kids, about 1 in 3 Latinx kids in Massachusetts are poor. Oops, wrong way. And even for near poor, it's not just, 200% of the poverty level, that's about an income about $48,000. That's tough to get by. About half of the kids in Pittsfield are near poor. So 1 in 4, when you don't have enough money, it's hard to afford rent. 1 in 4 households pay half their income on rent. These are the numbers here. for our communities. There's a range just because the sample sizes are small, but it could be as many as 3 out of 10 in North Adams are paying half their income on rent. And housing costs alone don't tell the whole story of affordability. This is a map I just want to show you. This shows affordable housing is green, but this is what happens when you add in the cost of transportation. All of a sudden, communities do not become so affordable. So what works? Well, we know that well-resourced communities help lower barriers to opportunity. Things such as investing in lowering the high cost of housing, education, from early education through affordable higher education. Investments that can help low-income families make ends meet, keep warm when it's weather like this outside, putting food on the table, having enough to get by. And I want to reiterate that policies matter, and policies can, and that's good news because we can change policy. Right? If we need to do something to change policy, we can do it. We have our elected officials right here. They know that. That's their work. So this is a Boston picture, people organizing to increase the minimum wage, which will benefit more than 20% of our kids in Massachusetts. Doubling the earned income tax credit, which benefits in North Adams about 1 in every 5 taxpayer benefits from the earned income tax credit. Balancing the needs of working families, earned paid sick time, paid family medical leave. These are recent victories, so victories can be done. But they're still ahead. There are still challenges: affordable child care, access to transportation so people can get to good jobs. And we know that there are obstacles. Sometimes the bridge doesn't stretch quite far enough. There are great programs, but they may be underfunded. Their funding might not keep up with inflation. There may be waiting lists, particularly Section 8 housing, childcare are 2 really strong examples of that. And there are potholes. You'll hear about the cliff effects, we call them potholes. They're sort of bumps in the road to opportunity as benefits phase out as your income goes up. And I want to end with some emerging roadblocks, new challenges. First of all, I do want to mention the census. I'm really passionate about the census. The federal census in 2020 will directly affect funding for each of these programs that's listed up here. And if we don't count every single person, every single kid, everybody, our communities will not get their fair share of their resources. The picture there is you know when the first census was? 1790. That's the 1790 census from Berkshire County, right there. Again, federal policies have significant impacts on our families and communities. Recent federal tax legislation pulled $1.5 trillion out of the federal budget, okay? And that puts the state budget in jeopardy because 1 out of every $4 in our state budget actually comes from the federal government. So when there are federal budget cuts, it can have an impact right here in Massachusetts. You may have heard a little bit about changes in immigration policy and concerns about redefining what public charge means. I'm not going to go into it here. You can look on our website, but that can have an impact on people who are eligible for programs being concerned about getting access to them. And the 2020 census has a big issue with whether there's going to be a citizenship question on it, and there's also the shutdown. Okay, so we don't know yet what the impact of that will be. But I will say I saw yesterday that for those of you who are concerned about clients who receive SNAP, I believe SNAP, they're trying to front load SNAP money so that there will be SNAP. People will get their SNAP benefits in February, but we don't know what will happen after that. So finally, the takeaways. Again, policies can have long-lasting impacts. Poverty is an outcome of low-wage work, under-resourced communities, and we can pass policies that improve work and that invest in our communities. And also, what happens in Washington matters in Massachusetts. But I think this is our promise. We all want to live in a Commonwealth where every family has their best chance at their brightest future. So thank you very much.